What if the real reason Meghan Markle will never be allowed back inside a royal residence has nothing to do with emotion, family rifts, or bruised pride, and everything to do with surveillance? Not tabloids, not gossip, surveillance. That word matters. Because once you introduce it, the story stops being about feelings and starts being about risk. Institutional risk, legal risk, reputational risk, and, quietly, national risk. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For years, the public narrative has been tidy. Almost too tidy. A modern duchess overwhelmed by an ancient system. A palace that didn't listen. A couple who chose love and freedom over tradition. It's a story that fits neatly into headlines and interviews. It's emotionally satisfying. It gives everyone a side to stand on. But there has always been a problem with that story. It leaves too much unexplained. Why senior palace aides suddenly stopped communicating in writing. Why internal meetings went undocumented. Why certain staff were reassigned without formal reasons. Why legal advisors appeared far earlier than anyone expected. Long before the Oprah interview. Long before the official exit. Long before the public conflict had a name. And why, years later, there are still doors that remain firmly closed. Permanently. This is not a historical story. That's important. This isn't about rehashing old grievances or replaying familiar clips. This is about why the monarchy, under King Charles III, has allegedly drawn a line so definitive that it has no precedent in modern royal history. Not a cooling-off period, not a conditional return, but an apparent, irreversible decision. A permanent ban is not emotional language. It's administrative language. It belongs to risk assessments, not family disputes. And that's where this story begins to feel different. Because according to a growing body of reporting, insider accounts, and legal whispers that have never quite made it into the mainstream, the palace's final break with Meghan Markle may have had very little to do with interviews or public accusations, and everything to do with what was happening quietly, behind closed doors, in the final months before she left the UK. Allegedly, those months were not defined by chaos or panic, but by preparation. Preparation is a strange word to use in this context. It implies foresight, strategy, a sense that what was coming next would not be improvised, but engineered. And that's where the most unsettling allegation enters the picture. The claim is not that Meghan was gathering stories for sympathy. The claim is not that she was simply documenting her experiences. The claim, according to multiple sources familiar with internal palace concerns, is that she quietly retained a US-based private intelligence or investigative firm, not for personal safety, but for what some insiders described as legal insurance. Insurance against whom? Against the institution she was still living inside. Let that sit for a moment. If you're inside an organization, bound by its protocols, protected by its security, and operating under its authority, and you hire an external intelligence operation to observe, document, or collect material on the people around you, that is no longer a personal grievance. That is an adversarial posture. And adversarial postures change everything. Now, to be clear, this allegation has never been tested in court. No firm has been publicly named. No contract has surfaced. And no definitive proof has been released into the public domain. That absence, however, is part of the story, not a contradiction of it. Because institutions like the British monarchy do not respond to unproven rumors with permanent bans. They respond to patterns, to risk assessments, to information they believe cannot safely be ignored. So the question isn't whether the public has seen the evidence. The question is whether the palace has, and whether what they saw was enough to justify closing the door forever. This is where the timeline becomes critical. The Oprah interview, conducted by Oprah Winfrey, has long been framed as the emotional climax of the Sussex departure, the moment where grievances became global, where silence was broken, where the palace lost control of the narrative. But what if that interview was not the beginning of the story, but the endpoint of a strategy already in motion? What if, by the time Meghan sat down in California, the real leverage had already been secured? Sources who have spoken off the record describe a period in late 2019 and early 2020 that felt different inside royal households. Not louder, quieter, more cautious. Emails replaced by phone calls. Phone calls replaced by in-person conversations. and in-person conversations shortened, stripped of color, reduced to the bare minimum. People who had spent decades navigating royal eccentricities began behaving like employees inside a litigation-sensitive corporation. Why? Because there was a growing belief that anything said, anything documented, could later be reframed, repurposed, or strategically deployed. This wasn't paranoia, they say. It was pattern recognition. And the pattern suggested that someone was no longer preparing to leave quietly. Someone was preparing to leave with leverage. Here's where the contradiction sharpens. Publicly, Meghan and Harry were still senior working royals, still representing the crown, still bound by confidentiality, duty, and trust. Privately, however, the relationship between the Sussex household and the palace apparatus was already fracturing in a way that could not be repaired. And when trust collapses inside a system built entirely on discretion, the response is not confrontation. It's containment. That's why this story matters now. Because the consequences of those months didn't end with an interview. They didn't end with a move to California. They didn't end with Netflix or memoirs or podcasts. They continue to shape access, invitations, proximity, silence. And silence, in this context, is not absence. It's evidence of something unresolved. Ask yourself this. Why has there never been a serious attempt at reintegration? Why have reconciliation narratives consistently stalled at the same invisible wall? Why do reports of possible returns always dissolve without explanation? Because reconciliation requires trust. And trust, once broken at an institutional level, is almost impossible to restore. This is where the idea of a dirty war enters the conversation, not in the tabloid sense, but in the legal one. Dirty wars are not loud. They are quiet. They involve documentation, timing, and restraint. They are fought in files, not on stages. And their most powerful weapon is not exposure. It's the threat of exposure. If you're watching closely, you start to notice something else. The palace never directly rebutted many of the most explosive claims made publicly, not because they lacked responses, but because responding would have required opening doors they were determined to keep shut, doors that lead to internal processes, legal assessments, security concerns, and possibly to evidence that could never be aired without escalating the situation beyond control. That's why the alleged permanent ban is so telling. It's not framed as punishment. It's framed as prevention. Prevention of access. Prevention of proximity. Prevention of opportunity. If you believe someone has already demonstrated a willingness to operate adversarially from inside your system, you don't give them another chance to do it again. You remove the risk, and you do it quietly. There is an emotional pull to this story: betrayal, disappointment, unresolved hurt. But beneath that is something colder and far more consequential. Power. Who holds it? Who loses it? And what happens when someone tries to extract it from an institution not designed to be negotiated with? This introduction is not here to prove the allegation. That will take time, careful steps, and a willingness to sit with ambiguity. It's here to establish that the official story may be incomplete, that the real rupture may have happened long before the cameras were rolling, and that what looks like exile may actually be the final move in a conflict the public never fully saw. Because if the palace believed, rightly or wrongly, that a member of the royal household had crossed from participant to opponent, the response would not be emotional. It would be absolute. And what comes next in this story is not about Meghan's feelings or Harry's loyalties or even public opinion. It's about the moment the palace stopped asking, "How do we fix this?" and started asking a very different question. How do we protect ourselves? But to understand when that shift happened and why, we have to go back to the first sign that something inside the system had quietly gone wrong. And it started with silence. Introduction complete. Each time I type go, continue writing the next section of the script based on the outline. Continuation rules. Pick up immediately from the previous cliffhanger. Do not reintroduce or recap unnecessarily. Maintain narrative momentum. Length. Minimum 2,000 words per section. Retention style. Open with a mini hook or provocative question. Escalate tension through emotional contrasts, contradictions, withheld information, narrative turns. Balance short, punchy lines with slower storytelling. Ask direct audience questions. Always end on a cliffhanger. Process. If the section has not reached 2,000 words, Stop and wait for GO. When a section is complete, clearly state that it's finished. Style. Conversational. Dramatic but controlled. Long-form YouTube investigative news tone. No fluff. No bolding. Human authenticity requirement. The writing must feel unmistakably human-written. Avoid symmetrical sentence patterns, formulaic transitions, or overly polished academic cadence. Use natural hesitation, subtle reframing, uneven pacing, and occasional unfinished thoughts. Allow controlled ambiguity, reflection, and restraint. The tone should resemble a seasoned journalist thinking out loud, not an AI delivering a script. Write as if the narrator is processing the information in real time, choosing words carefully, occasionally pulling back, and letting implications linger rather than explaining everything. Why would an institution built on ceremony, hierarchy, and paperwork suddenly stop writing things down? That question sounds small, administrative, almost boring. But inside a system like the royal household, silence is never accidental. The first warning sign didn't arrive with shouting or scandal. There was no dramatic confrontation, no slammed doors, no explosive memo. What changed first was something far more subtle and far more alarming to the people who noticed it. Things stopped being recorded. Not officially. No announcement. No directive. Just a quiet shift in behavior that only insiders would clock. Emails that would normally follow meetings didn't. Follow-up notes were delayed, then abandoned entirely. Conversations that once happened in shared spaces were suddenly pulled aside, lowered in volume, or postponed with vague promises to circle back later. And later never came. If you've ever worked inside a large institution, you know how strange that is. Bureaucracies survive on paper trails. They exist to create them. When that machinery hesitates, it's usually because someone is afraid of how a record might be used. So the question becomes unavoidable. Afraid of whom? This wasn't panic. Panic is messy. This was caution. Calculated. Almost rehearsed. Several former staffers, people with decades of experience navigating royal personalities, royal tempers, royal contradictions, described the same sensation during that period. A sense that the rules hadn't changed, but the consequences had. They weren't being told to keep quiet. They just chose to, because something in the air had shifted. One aide put it this way. It felt like being inside a room where you suddenly realize the walls are thinner than you thought. Not because someone told you, because you instinctively lower your voice. What would make seasoned professionals, trained to manage discretion under pressure, suddenly behave like that? It wasn't the press. The press had always been there. It wasn't public backlash. That comes later. It was the growing suspicion that private interactions, internal interactions, were no longer safely internal. And that suspicion didn't come from rumor. It came from pattern. Meetings with Meghan that once felt routine began to feel performative. Not emotionally. Strategically. Questions were asked in a way that felt less conversational and more documentary. Clarifications were requested repeatedly. Statements were reframed and restated, as if precision mattered more than resolution. At first, aides chalked it up to stress, to cultural difference, to a new royal still finding her footing. But over time, the pattern hardened. Why insist on exact wording for casual exchanges? Why revisit settled discussions? Why push for confirmations that didn't actually change outcomes? Unless, of course, the outcome wasn't the point. Unless the point was the record itself. This is where things get uncomfortable, because you start to realize that what looked like sensitivity might actually have been something else entirely. Preparation. And preparation implies intent. Inside Kensington Palace, and later across other royal residences, staff began adapting quietly. Not in rebellion. In self-protection. If something felt ambiguous, they avoided it. If a conversation veered into personal territory, they redirected it. If a request came through that felt unusual, they sought guidance. Not because it violated protocol, but because it might be misinterpreted later. Ask yourself this. Why would misinterpretation suddenly feel dangerous? Because misinterpretation only matters when someone intends to use it. This wasn't about fear of being misunderstood socially. It was fear of being reframed legally. And that's a very different thing. At some point, and no one can quite pinpoint the exact moment, the working assumption shifted. Staff stopped assuming they were dealing with a colleague navigating pressure. They began assuming they were interacting with someone who might one day become an opposing party. That shift is seismic. Once that happens, trust doesn't erode gradually. It collapses. And when trust collapses inside a royal household, the response isn't confrontation. It's containment. You don't accuse. You don't argue. You minimize exposure. Which explains the next strange development. Suddenly, certain aides were quietly reassigned. Not fired. Not demoted. Just moved. Roles adjusted. Responsibilities redistributed. No public rationale. No internal scandal. Just subtle distance being created. Distance from what? From conversations. From access. From proximity. If you were in the room less often, there was less to be captured, less to be reframed, less to be weaponized. And yes, that word matters. Weaponized. Because the fear wasn't that information would leak. The fear was that information would be strategically deployed. There's a difference. Leaks are chaotic. They embarrass everyone, including the leaker. Strategic deployment is surgical. It protects one side while damaging another. By late 2019, according to multiple accounts, senior figures inside the palace were no longer asking whether there was tension. They were asking whether there was intent. Intent to document. Intent to preserve. Intent to leverage. This is where the story pulls away from familiar ground. Because the public has been encouraged to see Meghan's final months in the UK as emotionally volatile. Tears, isolation, frustration, a sense of being trapped. And none of that is necessarily untrue. But emotional distress and strategic planning are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they often coexist. People who feel cornered sometimes prepare very carefully. What made this period especially unsettling for staff wasn't just the behavioral changes. It was the timing. Legal advisors began appearing earlier than expected. Not in response to lawsuits, there weren't any yet, but in anticipation of them. Consultations that felt preventative rather than reactive. Conversations framed around future scenarios. Future scenarios involving what exactly? Public statements. Internal disagreements. Interpretations of intent. It began to feel like the institution was preparing not for reconciliation, but for conflict. And conflict requires evidence. Now pause here, because this is where reasonable skepticism should kick in. Isn't it possible this was just paranoia? A misreading of stress? An overreaction by an ancient institution uncomfortable with change? Of course it's possible. But then explain this. Why did senior palace figures begin advising staff, quietly, informally, to keep interactions strictly professional, even when that wasn't the norm? Why the sudden emphasis on neutral language? Why the avoidance of anything that could be construed as personal judgment, even benign ones? Those precautions don't emerge from discomfort. They emerge from legal exposure. And legal exposure suggests someone believed the rules of engagement had changed. Here's the part that still unsettles people who lived through it. No one ever accused Meghan directly of spying. No one confronted her with suspicions. No internal investigation was announced. No memo warned of surveillance. Instead, the palace behaved as though it didn't need confirmation, as though the possibility alone was enough to trigger defensive posture. That tells you something important. Institutions that operate on rumor don't survive long. Institutions that operate on risk mitigation do. Which brings us to the most telling detail of all. At some point, staff began noticing that Meghan seemed less interested in resolution than in documentation. Less focused on outcomes than on process. Less concerned with how things would end than with how they could later be described. Descriptions matter when narratives are constructed after the fact. And narratives matter most when courts, media, or public opinion are involved. Ask yourself, and be honest, if you believed you might someday be involved in litigation or a public reckoning, wouldn't you start collecting material early? Wouldn't you want corroboration? Wouldn't you want leverage? That's not villainy. It's human instinct. But when that instinct operates inside a monarchy, it becomes something else entirely. Because the monarchy cannot afford ambiguity about intent. It cannot function if participants are secretly preparing for adversarial exit. That's why the silence spread. That's why conversations shrank. That's why documentation vanished. And that's why, quietly, the palace began treating the situation not as a personnel issue, but as a security concern. Not physical security, narrative security, legal security, institutional security. This is the context that makes later decisions, the coldness, the distance, the apparent finality, begin to make sense. It wasn't anger. It was calculation. And calculations are always made before the public sees the result. By the time the world learned Meghan and Harry were stepping back, the palace had already stepped away emotionally. The rupture had already occurred, not in public, but in trust. And once trust is gone, there is no return to normal, because every interaction becomes potential evidence. Every sentence becomes a liability. Every presence becomes a risk. When Meghan and Harry later described feeling unsupported by palace systems, that wasn't entirely inaccurate. But the reason for that lack of support wasn't indifference. It was mistrust. And mistrust changes behavior faster than any policy ever could. Once HR made the internal decision, conscious or not, to limit exposure rather than facilitate dialogue, the possibility of resolution collapsed. Because resolution requires trust. And trust, by this point, was already gone. The palace wasn't asking how to make Meghan feel safe. It was asking how to make itself safe. And those are not the same question. From here, things begin to accelerate. Not publicly, internally. Because once HR is no longer functioning as a bridge, the only remaining option is escalation upward. And that escalation doesn't involve emotion. It involves strategy. Legal advisors become more visible. Risk assessments expand. Access tightens. Documentation is scrubbed or minimized. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the institution shifts from coexistence to containment. The public will later see this as cruelty, as coldness, as a refusal to engage. But inside the palace, it felt like the only rational response to a situation that had already crossed an invisible line. The line where internal conflict becomes external threat. The line where HR stops being about people and starts being about protection. But HR wasn't the only system reacting. Because as these internal defenses were going up, someone else was watching, observing, noticing the silence, and interpreting it not as withdrawal, but as confirmation. Confirmation that whatever was being prepared was working, and that realization would trigger the next move. One that would take this out of the realm of internal management and into something far more dangerous. Because once legal strategy enters the room, the clock starts ticking. And the palace, whether it knew it yet or not, was already on borrowed time. Chapter 2 complete. Go. Why would lawyers show up before there was anything to defend? That was the question that unsettled people the most. Not that legal counsel existed. Of course it did. The monarchy has lawyers the way a city has streetlights. They're always there, just out of sight. But this was different. This wasn't reaction. It was anticipation. The legal clock didn't start ticking because of a lawsuit. There was no formal threat, no claim letter, no public allegation yet. And still, legal conversations were happening, quietly, deliberately, as if everyone involved understood that the current moment wasn't the danger. The future was. Inside the palace ecosystem, there's an informal rule that everyone learns early. Lawyers appear when something has already gone wrong, when press coverage spirals, when lines have been crossed, when a response is unavoidable. What raised eyebrows in late 2019 wasn't that lawyers were consulted. It was when they appeared not at the peak of conflict, but during its quietest phase. While the public still believed the Sussex story was unfolding emotionally, stress, pressure, misunderstandings, the institution was already thinking in terms of scenarios. Hypotheticals. Exposure maps. What if this ends badly? What if statements are made later? What if internal processes are challenged? Those are not emotional questions. They're structural ones. And structure is where this story turns. Legal advisors were not being asked how to smooth things over. They were being asked how to prepare for divergence, for separation that might not be friendly, for narratives that could clash violently with institutional memory. This is where the timeline becomes crucial. Because long before the Oprah interview was filmed, long before negotiations were publicly acknowledged, the palace had begun asking itself what it would look like if a senior royal exited not quietly, but adversarially. That word again. Adversarial. It's uncomfortable, but it keeps resurfacing for a reason. Adversarial exits are rare in royal history. The system isn't designed for them. Royals are supposed to fade, not fight. To withdraw, not litigate. To disappear into private life, not reemerge with claims. When legal counsel began mapping potential future disputes, it suggested a belief that this exit would not follow precedent. And beliefs like that don't come from nowhere. They come from signals. One signal was language. Lawyers are exquisitely sensitive to language. They listen for phrasing that implies intent, for repeated framing that suggests a narrative is being shaped. During this period, some legal advisors reportedly flagged a pattern. Repeated emphasis on perception over process, on feeling over protocol, on harm over intent. That framing isn't wrong, but it is strategic. It's the kind of framing that becomes powerful later, when stories are told publicly. Another signal was timing. Discussions about non-disclosure obligations, confidentiality boundaries, and jurisdictional exposure began earlier than anyone expected. These weren't negotiations yet. They were rehearsals. Rehearsals for what happens when private disagreement becomes public dispute. Here's where things get even more revealing. At the same time the palace was preparing defensively, there was growing awareness that preparations might be happening on the other side too. Not publicly, privately. People noticed a change in focus. Less attention on resolving internal dynamics. More attention on how those dynamics might later be described. It's subtle, but it's important. There's a difference between saying, "This is hurting me," and saying, "This could be used." One is emotional processing. The other is strategic positioning. By late 2019, legal advisors were quietly advising palace staff to assume that internal disagreements might one day be replayed externally, selectively, and without full context. That assumption alone changes everything. Because once you assume future litigation or public accusation, your obligation shifts. You're no longer just managing people. You're managing risk. And risk management doesn't look warm. It looks cautious. It looks slow. It looks like silence. Now, pause here, because this is where critics will rightly push back. Isn't this just an institution overreacting? Isn't this what powerful systems do? Protect themselves first? Yes, absolutely. But the question isn't whether the palace protected itself. The question is why it felt the need to do so before the threat was visible. And that brings us to the Oprah interview, or more precisely, to the anticipation of it. Before a single camera rolled, before a single question was asked on air, the idea of a major public reckoning had already entered internal calculations. Not because it was announced, but because the behavior surrounding the exit suggested it. Negotiations over departure terms were not just about logistics. They were about narrative boundaries. Who could say what, when, and how? Legal teams don't involve themselves in emotional exits unless they believe narratives are about to collide. And collision was coming. The palace wasn't trying to silence Meghan. That's a lazy interpretation. What it was trying to do was avoid being dragged into a forum where it couldn't defend itself without breaking its own rules. That's an impossible position. Courts demand evidence. Media demands stories. The monarchy operates on discretion. Those three things do not coexist comfortably. Which is why the palace has historically avoided public legal conflict at almost any cost. But here, avoidance was no longer guaranteed. This is where the phrase legal insurance starts to make sense, even without proof. Insurance isn't about certainty. It's about preparation for unlikely but catastrophic outcomes. If you believe you might one day need to justify your version of events, legally or publicly, you don't wait until the moment arrives. You prepare. You document. You preserve. You secure leverage. And if you suspect the other side might be doing the same, your preparation becomes more urgent. This is the spiral that defined the final months before the exit. Each side, operating quietly, interpreting the other's caution as confirmation of risk. Each side stepping back, not to cool things down, but to limit exposure. And in the middle of it all, an HR system turned firewall, a legal apparatus warming up, and a household slowly realizing that this was no longer a family matter. It was a potential case. The public wouldn't see any of this. They would see emotion, tears, interviews, headlines. But behind the scenes, the real drama was procedural. Who controls the record? Who controls timing? Who controls interpretation? Those questions matter more than feelings when the stakes are institutional survival. At some point, and again, no one can point to the exact moment, the palace crossed an internal threshold. It stopped believing this would end quietly. That belief didn't come from malice. It came from behavior, from repetition, from preparation on the other side that mirrored its own. And once both sides believe the exit will be adversarial, the outcome is no longer negotiable. It's managed. This is why, later, When the Oprah interview finally aired, the palace's response wasn't outrage. It was restraint, almost as if it had already rehearsed that moment. Because in a sense, it had. The interview didn't feel like an ambush. It felt like confirmation. Confirmation that the assumptions made months earlier, the legal consultations, the HR firewall, the documentation freeze, had not been misplaced. And if that's true, then the most important actions in this story happened before anyone outside the palace knew there was a story at all. Before the cameras, before the speeches, before the tears. The legal clock had already started ticking. And once it starts, it doesn't stop. It only counts down. But here's the part that complicates everything. Legal preparation doesn't happen in a vacuum. If one side is preparing, the other side often senses it. And sensing it changes behavior, which raises the most unsettling question of all. What if the preparations on one side weren't just defensive, but responsive? What if someone else had already made a move? A move so quiet it didn't register as confrontation, but so deliberate it triggered everything that followed. Because the palace didn't lock down simply out of fear. It locked down because it believed something was already in motion. And the next chapter is where that belief begins to take shape. Because that's when an external presence, subtle, professional, and allegedly American, enters the story. And once that happens, this stops being about lawyers and HR. It becomes about intelligence. And who was watching whom? Chapter 3 complete. Go. What kind of security doesn't protect, but observes? That was the question that began circulating quietly, not in emails, not in meetings, but in the spaces in between. The pauses after conversations. The looks exchanged when something felt slightly off, but not off enough to confront directly. Because this wasn't a bodyguard issue. No one was talking about physical threats. There were no concerns about intruders or stalkers or paparazzi breaches. Palace security had handled those risks for generations. This was different. This was about information, and more specifically, about who might be collecting it. The first thing to understand is how foreign the very idea felt inside the royal system. The palace is many things: hierarchical, traditional, resistant to change, but it is also deeply insular. Problems are handled internally. Even crises are contained within a tight circle of trusted professionals. You don't outsource trust, which is why the mere suggestion that an external intelligence operation could be operating in parallel, quietly, professionally, without announcement, was so destabilizing. No one saw a contract. No one overheard a conversation saying, "We've hired a firm." There was no smoking gun moment. What there was, instead, was a growing sense that information was being treated differently. Questions were asked that felt less like curiosity and more like calibration. Interactions were revisited with an unusual focus on exact wording. Conversations were referenced later in ways that suggested they had been carefully remembered or noted rather than simply experienced. Again, none of this proves anything. But inside institutions, proof isn't always what triggers response. Pattern is. And the pattern suggested that someone was thinking several steps ahead. This is where the allegation of a US-based private intelligence or investigative firm enters the narrative, cautiously, carefully, without names or dramatic flourishes. Not because names don't matter, but because what matters more is function. The kind of firms being whispered about in palace circles at the time weren't paparazzi adjacent. They weren't tabloid fixers or celebrity security outfits. They were described, by people familiar with the industry, as litigation support or corporate intelligence operations. The kind of firms companies hire when they anticipate lawsuits. The kind of firms that don't chase stories, they build files. If you've never encountered that world, it's easy to misunderstand it. These firms don't bug rooms or hack phones. That's not how modern corporate intelligence works. What they do is far more mundane and far more powerful. They map relationships. They document interactions. They track inconsistencies. They preserve contemporaneous accounts. In other words, they prepare narratives before narratives are needed. And if that sounds uncomfortably close to what the palace feared, that's not a coincidence. Here's where things get especially delicate. According to multiple accounts, the palace never confirmed the existence of such a firm. It never accused Meghan directly of employing one, and it never publicly referenced intelligence concerns. Instead, it acted as if the risk was real enough to warrant containment, regardless of whether absolute proof existed. That distinction matters, Because institutions that wait for proof before acting often act too late. Institutions that act on credible risk signals tend to look cold, paranoid, or excessive from the outside. But they survive. Inside the palace, the logic went something like this. If an external firm is collecting material, even passively, then any interaction could later be reframed as evidence. Not necessarily false evidence, but selectively framed evidence. That possibility alone was enough to change behavior. Meetings were shortened. Attendees were limited. Informal interactions became rarer. Casual check-ins were replaced with scheduled, purpose-driven exchanges. And crucially, access narrowed. Because access is the raw material of intelligence gathering. The fewer rooms you're in, the fewer narratives you can build. This is why the allegation of a private intelligence firm, whether ultimately proven or not, had such outsized impact. It transformed Meghan's presence from participant to potential observer. And observers change systems simply by existing. There's another uncomfortable layer here. The palace had no framework for handling this kind of situation internally. Royal protocols assume loyalty. They assume discretion. They assume shared interest in preserving the institution. They do not assume adversarial documentation from within. So when senior figures began to suspect that someone might be quietly building a case, not emotionally, but evidentially, the response wasn't disciplinary. It was strategic withdrawal. This explains why, in retrospect, Meghan's final months appear strangely uneventful on the surface. No dramatic blow-ups. No public reprimands. No visible collapse. Because everything important was happening underneath. If you're preparing for a potential legal or reputational confrontation, you don't provoke it prematurely. You minimize exposure. You let the other side reveal its hand. And that's exactly what the palace appeared to do. What complicates this further is the timing. The alleged involvement of an external firm is said to have occurred during Meghan's final months in the UK, a period when her departure was not yet publicly announced, and when she was still operating as a senior working royal. That matters, because at that point, she was still inside the system, still protected by it, still bound by it, and still granted access on the assumption of shared interest. If, during that time, an external intelligence operation was indeed gathering material, even indirectly, that would represent a fundamental breach of trust, not a legal breach, a relational one. And relational breaches are the ones institutions respond to most decisively. Here's the contradiction that sits at the heart of this allegation. From Meghan's perspective, if you believe her public account, she felt unsafe, unsupported, vulnerable. Documenting experiences, even rigorously, could feel like self-preservation. From the palace's perspective, documentation without transparency looks like preparation for conflict. Both interpretations can exist simultaneously, and that's what makes this so volatile. No one inside the palace was interested in proving malicious intent. That would require confrontation, escalation, and evidence they didn't want to surface. What they were interested in was preventing future damage. Which brings us back to that phrase, legal insurance. Insurance isn't about certainty. It's about plausible risk. If Meghan believed she might one day need to defend her version of events, in court, in media, or in public opinion, retaining professional support to document interactions would be rational. But rational actions can still have consequences, especially when they collide with institutions that value opacity over narrative competition. At some point, the palace appears to have made a quiet decision. Regardless of intent, this situation could no longer be treated as normal. And once that decision was made, the rules changed. Information flow tightened. Trust assumptions evaporated. And most importantly, the possibility of future access was re-evaluated entirely. This is where the alleged permanent ban begins to make sense, not as punishment, but as risk elimination. If someone is perceived to have used internal access to build leverage once, you don't give them the opportunity to do it again. Not ever. That's not emotional. It's procedural. But before we get there, there's a missing piece. Because intelligence gathering, even the passive kind, requires targets. It requires focus. It requires choices about who matters and who doesn't. And according to multiple sources, the people who felt the most watched during this period were not senior royals. They were staff, not the powerful, the invisible, the ones who schedule, advise, interpret, and smooth. The ones whose words, taken out of context, could sound very different later. Which raises the next, deeply unsettling question. If someone was building leverage, who exactly were they watching? And why those people? Because the answer to that question reveals far more than any allegation ever could. And that's where this story goes next. Why would anyone pay attention to people the public barely knows exist? That question sat uncomfortably with those who began to feel it first, not senior royals, not household names, not figures whose words carry obvious power. The unease settled instead on aides, schedulers, communication staff, HR intermediaries. People staff are the connective. Advise. They remember. And crucially, they speak in ways that are informal, human, unguarded, precisely because they are not the public face, which makes them invaluable if you're trying to reconstruct how an institution behaves when the cameras are off. This is where the atmosphere inside the palace shifted from cautious to quietly alarmed. Several aides later described the same sensation, an awareness that they were being listened to more closely than before. Not by security, not by supervisors, but by someone who seemed to care deeply about how events might later be described. Not resolved, described. Conversations began to feel oddly rehearsed in retrospect. Questions returned later with phrasing that suggested recall rather than memory. Statements were paraphrased back in ways that felt curated. Again, none of this was overt. No one accused anyone. No one said, "You're being watched." That would have been absurd. Instead, people adjusted. They spoke less. They shared less context. They stopped filling silences. Because the feeling wasn't that someone was listening in real time. It was that someone was building a record. And records don't require microphones. They require attention. One aide recalled being asked, weeks after a routine exchange, to clarify what they meant by a phrase that had seemed inconsequential at the time. Another described being surprised by how accurately a minor scheduling disagreement was later recounted, down to tone, timing, and implied intent. You can dismiss one instance as coincidence. Multiple instances feel like method. This is where the alleged targeting becomes significant. If you wanted to build legal leverage against an institution, you wouldn't focus on its figureheads. They're too guarded, too rehearsed, too protected. You would focus on the people who operate in the gray zones. The ones who speak candidly. The ones who improvise. The ones who don't expect their words to one day be examined under oath. And that, according to several accounts, is exactly who began to feel the pressure first. Staff didn't believe they were being spied on in the cinematic sense. No one imagined hidden cameras or tapped phones. That's not how modern intelligence gathering works, especially not in environments saturated with security already. What they sensed instead was something more psychological, that their words mattered more than before, that their interpretations might outlive the moment, that they were no longer just employees, they were potential witnesses. And witnesses, once they realize they might be treated as such, behave very differently. This is where the palace's internal response hardened further. Senior figures began quietly advising staff to keep interactions strictly task-focused. No commentary, no speculation, no personal interpretation. If something needed to be said, say it plainly and briefly. Not because staff had done anything wrong, because anything could be reframed later. Think about how corrosive that is to a working environment. Trust doesn't disappear in a single argument. It erodes when people feel they are being observed for future use rather than engaged in the present. And that erosion was felt most acutely by those least equipped to defend themselves publicly. Aides don't have platforms. They don't give interviews. They don't write memoirs. If their words were ever presented out of context, they would have no meaningful way to respond. That vulnerability sharpened the fear. And fear produces compliance, not confrontation. This is why there were no whistleblowers during this period. No leaks saying, something strange is happening. Silence wasn't enforced. It was chosen, because speaking up would only create more material. This is where the story diverges sharply from the idea of a toxic workplace, driven by personalities alone. Toxicity implies chaos, outbursts, unpredictability. What staff experienced instead was precision, careful listening, selective memory, and a growing sense that someone was interested not in solving problems, but in preserving them, intact, documented, ready to be referenced. That's not how you behave if you expect to stay. That's how you behave if you're preparing to leave. The irony, of course, is that this behavior, if it existed, may have felt entirely justified from the other side. If Meghan believed she was being misunderstood, marginalized, or mistreated, documenting interactions with staff could feel like self-defense. A way to ensure her version of events wasn't erased by an institution known for controlling narrative. From that perspective, aides weren't targets. They were sources. Unwitting, perhaps, but central. And that's what made the situation untenable for the palace. Because institutions cannot function if internal actors feel they are being mined for future conflict. Once that perception takes hold, the only rational response is to reduce exposure. Which explains why certain staff were quietly moved away from direct contact. Why layers were added between Meghan and key operational roles. Why communication became formalized to the point of sterility. This wasn't punishment. It was insulation. And it had consequences. Because as insulation increased, Meghan's experience likely became more isolating, less human, more bureaucratic, which in turn may have reinforced her sense of alienation and grievance. You can see how the spiral feeds itself. Perceived documentation leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to isolation. Isolation fuels grievance. Grievance justifies further documentation. And around it goes. At some point, someone inside the palace articulated the unspoken fear. Not in dramatic terms. Not as an accusation. But as a risk scenario. What if this is all being saved? Saved for what? For later. Later when context is gone. Later when tone is forgotten. Later when memory competes with record. That question alone was enough to push the institution toward a line it had never crossed before. It stopped assuming good faith. That doesn't mean it assumed bad faith. It assumed uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison in environments built on trust. From that moment on, the palace began acting not as an employer managing a difficult employee, but as an institution managing potential adversarial exposure. Which reframes everything that followed. Because once staff were seen as potential sources of leverage, not by choice, but by circumstance, the palace's responsibility shifted. It wasn't just about protecting the crown's image. It was about protecting its people. People who had not consented to being part of a future narrative. People who had not agreed to have their words preserved, reframed, and possibly deployed in a public reckoning. That ethical dimension is often missing from public debate. Staff didn't choose this conflict. They were caught inside it. And institutions that care about their survival and their workforce will act decisively when they believe that workforce is being exposed. This is why, according to those familiar with internal deliberations, the palace began treating access itself as the core risk. Not interviews, not statements. Access. Who speaks to whom? Who is in the room? Who hears what? Who can later say, this is what happened? Access is power when stories are written later. So access narrowed. Not dramatically, incrementally. Until one day, people realized that the relationship was no longer functional. Not because of a fight, but because of a fundamental misalignment of intent. One side believed it was documenting harm. The other believed it was being documented as harm. And there is no middle ground between those two positions. That's why the final months feel so eerily quiet in retrospect. No explosions. No ultimatums. Just distance. And distance, in this context, wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Because once you believe your staff may be used as leverage, intentionally or not, you don't wait for confirmation. You act. Which leads directly to the next phase of this story. Because if documentation was being gathered, it wasn't being gathered randomly. It had a purpose. And that purpose wasn't about the present. It was about what would happen after the exit. After the cameras. After the interviews. After the world picked sides. The question the palace began asking wasn't, who is being watched? It was, what is this all for? And the answer points to something that would reshape everything that followed. A strategy designed not for resolution, but for protection. Protection against the moment when private conflict would become public spectacle. And that moment was already being planned. Chapter 5 complete. Go. What if the interview wasn't the explosion, but the armor? That idea unsettled people inside the palace long before anyone ever saw a clip of Meghan on a couch, hands folded, voice steady. Because by the time the world framed the Oprah interview as a cathartic release, the institution had already begun to see it as something else entirely. A culmination. not of emotion, of preparation. This is the moment where the timeline tightens and where motive starts to look less abstract. Because once the possibility of documentation and leverage enters the story, you have to ask the next question. To what end? People don't collect information indefinitely. They collect it for use. And use implies timing. Inside royal circles, the word that began circulating quietly wasn't revenge or exposure. It was insurance. Legal insurance. Insurance against being dismissed. Against being contradicted. Against being told later, that's not how it happened. Insurance against an institution whose greatest strength has always been its control of narrative. If you believe you're about to leave a system that will outlast you, outsilence you, and outweigh you, you prepare differently. You don't just speak. You corroborate. And corroboration doesn't start after you leave. It starts while you're still inside. This is why, according to those familiar with the internal mindset at the time, the palace did not view the Oprah interview as a spontaneous act of defiance. It viewed it as the visible tip of something much longer in motion. Something that had already accounted for likely responses. Silence. Non-denial denials. Institutional restraint. All of it predictable, and therefore manageable. This reframing changes how you understand the months leading up to the exit. Because once you assume the interview is coming, even in broad strokes, every interaction before it takes on new significance. Not as a moment to resolve conflict, but as potential supporting material. Did someone dismiss a concern? Did someone minimize a feeling? Did someone phrase something poorly? In real time, those moments might pass unnoticed. Later, they become narrative anchors. This is why the alleged focus on staff matters so much. Staff are the ones who deliver messages, who translate decisions, who cushion policy. If you later claim the institution failed you, staff interactions become evidence of systemic behavior, not malice, systemic coldness. And systemic coldness is easier to argue than personal hostility. Inside the palace, this realization sharpened anxieties further. Because you can defend a decision, you cannot easily defend a tone. Tone lives in memory, in interpretation, in what someone felt rather than what was said. That's why legal advisors were so concerned with how things might later be framed. Not lied about. Framed. There's a crucial difference. By this stage, the palace wasn't assuming bad faith. It was assuming incompatible objectives. Meghan, it appeared, was preparing to tell her story in a forum where emotion would matter more than protocol. The palace was preparing to survive that telling without violating its own rules. Those two aims were never going to align. This is where the concept of legal insurance becomes even more telling. Insurance doesn't mean you plan to crash the car. It means you recognize the risk. And the risk, from Meghan's perspective, may have been this. Once she left, the palace could simply say nothing. And silence, coming from an institution, carries weight. If no one contradicts you, your story floats. If no one confirms you, it drifts. Legal insurance ensures it doesn't drift alone. It anchors. It says, others were there. Others heard this. Others saw that. Even if those others never speak publicly. The existence of records changes power dynamics. And power dynamics are everything in disputes between individuals and institutions. Here's the part that's rarely discussed. The Oprah interview didn't include hard evidence. No documents. No emails. No recordings. And yet, it carried confidence. Confidence that the narrative wouldn't collapse under scrutiny. Confidence that contradictions could be absorbed. Confidence that silence would not undo it. That confidence doesn't come from emotion alone. It comes from preparation. Inside the palace, that confidence was interpreted not as courage, but as calculation. And calculations are what institutions fear most, because they can't be soothed. They can only be countered. Which brings us to the palace's most consequential decision. It stopped trying to shape the exit. It focused instead on shaping the future. Not publicly, internally. The assumption became, if the interview happens and if claims are made, the institution must be able to say, truthfully, that it did everything possible to minimize exposure, prevent misinterpretation, and protect its people. This is where access tightened further. Not because of punishment, because of precedent. If Meghan were ever allowed back into royal spaces, even years later, the risk wouldn't be emotional discomfort. It would be narrative contamination. Every new interaction would carry the potential to be recontextualized through the lens of past grievance. And once that lens exists, it never disappears. This is why insiders later described the decision as irreversible, not because of anger, because of risk modeling. The palace didn't ask, "Can we trust her again?" It asked, "What happens if we're wrong?" And the answer to that question was unacceptable. Because if the palace reopened access and something went wrong, another interview, another claim, another reframing, the institution would have no defense left. It would look reckless, and institutions cannot afford to look reckless. This is where the emotional tragedy of the situation becomes clear. From Meghan's side, documentation and preparation may have felt like survival, like ensuring she wouldn't be erased. From the palace's side, that same preparation looked like a breach so fundamental it couldn't be undone. Both sides believed they were protecting themselves, and in doing so, they made reconciliation impossible. By the time Oprah aired, the real decisions had already been made. Not about public response, about access, about trust, about permanence. The interview didn't trigger the ban. It confirmed the logic behind it, which is why the palace's reaction felt so eerily calm. No rebuttal interview, no detailed counterclaims, no emotional response. Because from their perspective, the conflict phase had already passed. This was now the containment phase. And containment doesn't require noise. It requires distance, permanent distance. But there's one more layer to this. One that complicates the idea of legal insurance even further. Because insurance only matters if you expect enforcement. Courts, contracts, claims. Which raises a question the palace could not ignore. What kind of disputes was Meghan preparing for? Employment disputes? Defamation? Institutional misconduct? The scope matters. Because the broader the potential claims, the greater the risk to the institution. And that's where the palace's internal alarm bells reached their loudest point. Because if the documentation being gathered wasn't just about feelings, but about process, HR handling, duty of care, internal response, then this wasn't about reputation. It was about liability. And liability changes everything. This is the moment when the palace stopped thinking in terms of royal history and started thinking like a corporation under threat. Corporations don't negotiate with perceived adversaries inside their walls. They isolate them. They remove access. They close systems. And once that happens, the path back is gone. Not because forgiveness is impossible, because risk is permanent. This is why the phrase, permanent ban, isn't as shocking internally as it is publicly. From the outside, it sounds cruel. From the inside, it sounds inevitable. Because once legal insurance is taken out, trust is canceled. And once trust is canceled, the relationship isn't broken. It's reclassified from participant to risk. And risks aren't invited back in. But there's something else that hasn't been addressed yet. Because insurance is only effective if it's never needed. And if it is needed, it means something has already failed. So the palace had one final question to answer. What if this doesn't end with an interview? What if this continues? What if access, even at a distance, remains a vulnerability? That question pushed the institution toward its most decisive move yet. One that had nothing to do with emotion, apology, or reconciliation. And everything to do with prevention. Because the palace wasn't just reacting to what had happened. It was preparing for what might come next. And what came next required something the monarchy almost never does. A lockdown. Why would an institution that has survived wars, abdications, and scandals decide the safest move was to close itself off? Not publicly, not dramatically, but methodically. Because by the time the palace reached this phase, it wasn't reacting to an interview, or a headline, or even a person. It was reacting to a scenario, a model of risk that had been run, revised, and run again until the conclusion stopped changing. The conclusion was simple, even if the implications were not. Exposure could no longer be managed through relationship. It had to be managed through restriction. This is where the idea of a lockdown begins to make sense. Not as an event, but as a process. No announcement. No visible shift to the outside world. Just a quiet tightening of the system, layer by layer, until access itself became conditional. And then, eventually, theoretical. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this story is how unemotional this phase was. People imagine slammed doors, heated arguments, dramatic ultimatums. That's not how institutions like this operate. Drama creates records. Emotion creates ambiguity. What followed instead was something far colder. Procedure. The first changes were so subtle they were almost invisible. Calendars became harder to access. Invitations were rerouted. Requests that would once have been approved automatically were delayed, then declined, then quietly discontinued. Not refused. Discontinued. There's a difference. Refusal invites challenge. Discontinuation dissolves expectation. Inside the palace, staff were instructed, again, not formally, to assume that any access granted now would be permanent precedent. And precedent is the most dangerous thing an institution can create accidentally. If Meghan were allowed into a residence, even briefly, it could later be framed as tacit approval. If she were included in an event, it could be read as reconciliation. If she were photographed in proximity, it could undo months of containment in a single image. Images don't care about context.